Philipa Rothfield is Adjunct Professor in Dance and Philosophy of the Body at the University of Southern Denmark and an Honorary Senior Lecturer at the Trobe University, Australia. She's a philosopher and occasional dancer. Occasional? No. She was a member of the Modern Dance Ensemble directed by Margaret Lasica. Am I saying that right? Lasica? And has an intermittent opportunities to work with Russell Dumas. She has co-authored Practising with Deleuze, Edinburgh University Press, co-edited Choreography and Corporeality, and co-edited Dancehouse Diary. She's a creative advisor at Dancehouse, co-editor of Dancehouse Diary, and the co-convener of the Choreography and Corporeality Working Group. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Philipa.
Well, hello everybody, and first of all let me just thank the organisers of today's conference for inviting me to speak, and it's also been a great pleasure to hear some of you speak in the days so far. So big thanks for organising, because I know it's a big job. According to Larissa Behrendt, Australian colonising subjectivity occupies still a sense of psychological terra nullius, as if no one was here before colonising forces arrived. So, to remind myself as much as you, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and its elders, past, present and emerging. Overview. In Volatile Bodies, Elizabeth Gross offers an account of the self through the figure of the body. She draws on the notion of the Mobius strip to think the inside becoming outside, becoming inside. My project today is to think embodied cognition through the figure of the body in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. So it's a little bit different from the abstract, where I thought I could cover two paradigms of thought, and I just thought if I do that, I'm not going to be able to spend enough time on either and talk about dance and kind of like get into it. So I feel that what Sean has given us today is a great and couldn't be better kind of enunciation of one of the paradigms that I work with in relation to phenomenology, and here's the other one. Gilles Deleuze offers an interpretation of the body in Nietzschean philosophy through the concept of force. His claim is that a body emerges when forces enter into relation. He draws on the notion of force to give an account of subjectivity as a mode of interiorization. For Deleuze, forces either corporealize in motion, through what Erin Manning might call the becoming body, or they fold inwards to form droplets of experience. The becoming of forces to form the body and the becoming of forces to produce experience represent two different types of formation, different in kind. In this way, Deleuze offers a reading of Nietzsche's claim that there is no doer behind the deed, through offering an account of the dynamics of force, where action, the deed, is a mode of corporeal formation. According to this account, the subject position is but an interpretation of the body, equally formed from relations of force, but not itself a mode of corporeal activity. This is not a form of Cartesian dualism, which suggests that the body is animated by an incorporeal mind. Rather, an attempt to side with the body with the notion of bodily activity thought apart from an animating consciousness. That's the overview. So to begin, my topic is embodied cognition, which I take to be a question of thought in the body. In what follows, I'm going to offer a particular way of thinking the body so as to say something about thought and action, or more precisely, about the difference between consciousness and action within a corporeal frame. So I think then it's a further question of what does this distinction between consciousness and action say for the notion of thought? How do we want to think thought? Same as consciousness, different? Is consciousness embedded? Whatever. So it's open to then think that through in relation to questions of cognition. In Nietzschean philosophy, Deleuze offers an interpretation of the body that makes sense of Nietzsche's claim that there's no doer behind the deed. He does so through analysing becoming, that which happens, in relation to the concept of force. He concentrates on two kinds of becoming. One, which involves corporeal formation, the other, the production of consciousness. In the process, Deleuze shows how Nietzschean philosophy can account for human action without resorting to an underlying subjective agency. Such an approach eschews the identity and agency of the subject for the difference and plurality of force. Corporeal formation is a relational affair, transitory, mobile and provisional. Which is not to say that we don't experience what a body does as the work of an authorial agency. Nietzsche readily acknowledged the hermeneutic tenacity of the subject position as regards its need to appropriate the body as its vehicle of expression. Pierre Klosowski looks to the body in Nietzsche as a site of dynamic transformation, which must be thought apart from subject-centred modes of explanation. While we tend to merge the body with subjectivity, Klosowski draws an ontological and epistemological wedge between the felt identity of the self on the one hand and the dynamic activities of the body on the other. To be clear, Klosowski's discussion of mind and body is not a form of Cartesian dualism. For Klosowski, the Nietzschean body is the source and basis of action. Doing is a mode of corporeal formation, not the result of any animating intentionality directed towards or found in the body. Klosowski begins by positing the body as a series of corporeal states which come into being, then pass. The body is not a stable site of activity, rather that which ensues from the serial interaction of impulsive states or forces. A momentary body forms for Klosowski because its constituent contestatory elements resolve their differences in a particular way. Such resolution emerges by way of corporeal formation. The body is thus an outcome, an assemblage, albeit a provisional and transitory one. Klosowski sees the activity of the impulses as ontogenetic, productive, making of what becomes, producing what Aaron Manning might call the becoming body. The impulses give shape to that which is inherently indeterminate. They access and take up corporeal circumstance, forming a movement towards the production of new corporeal circumstance. Klosowski sees consciousness as something other than, in fact, other to, the body's successive impulsive states. For Klosowski, subjectivity is formed in terms of a hermeneutic encounter with the body, locked into an interpretation that favours the coherence of personal identity rather than the flux of corporeal becoming. The mismatch arises because consciousness is founded upon the need for subjective communication, articulated by Nietzsche in The Gay Science, whereby the herd, that's us, the social group, is characterised by its need to communicate with one another. Klosowski's point is that a system of social exchange is ill-suited to discern the serial succession of singular corporeal states. Deleuze similarly introduces the Nietzschean body as a corrective to philosophy's historical prioritization of consciousness. The body is not the servant of consciousness here. Rather, the body is the superior formation, a mode of becoming to be valued apart from the workings of consciousness. According to Deleuze, a body forms when forces form a relation with one another. He writes, "Any two forces, being unequal, constitute a body as soon as they enter into relationship. A body can arise within many registers, chemical, biological, social, political. Deleuze emphasises the body's mobility through denying its status as any kind of fixed ground or site of struggle. The Nietzschean body is neither an identity nor a substance that undergoes change, rather a series of changes that arrive at the putative identity of the bodily self. The body in Nietzsche thus destabilises rather than supplements subjectivity. It is not a stable, well-organised identity to which we can attribute agency, an embodied substitute for disembodied subjectivity, nor is it a stable identity which moves. Rather, its moving gives a body, a coagulation of forces, a temporary and provisional equilibrium. Force is one way of conceptualising the many factors that comprise the body in the course of movement. Force is a plural and dynamic concept. In the context of dance, the notion of force stands for the multiplicity of tendencies found in movement. Forces are virtual tendencies whose emergent character depends upon their eventual articulation with other modes of virtual tendency. Force takes shape in relation to other forces. Because force is not singular but relational, the field of future possibility is not contained in any one force as a predetermined identity, bent leg, straight leg, and so on, but depends upon the way in which forces combine over time. Conceptually singular, force exists in the plural, to be found in its concrete elaboration with other forces. Depending on their context, the tendencies of force can also be referred to as drives, impulses, instincts, even thoughts, feelings, or affects. Forces are heterogeneous and polymorphic. They hail from multiple sources. All kinds of force, ecological, biological, physiological, economic, cultural, social, and kinesthetic, enter interrelation in the course of movement, which would not occur but for their complex and interrelated interactions. Dance is a field of selection within this wider field of relations of force. The body equally, the human body equally enters into this complex mix of relations, conditions, modes of organisation and reorganisation. A distinctive feature of the Nietzschean approach is the view that forces are not equal, nor do they come together in a cooperative fashion. Whatever occurs does so for Nietzsche because some forces or sets of force master others. According to this mode of thought, movement is an expression of mastery. Movement occurs because force imposes itself upon other forces, using them, drawing upon them, mastering them to generate an action or event, using the floor to push off, drawing on traditional idiom in order to stage a contemporary departure, creating phrase material through deconstruction and reconstruction, resisting habit to enable new movement possibilities. The hierarchical conception of force analyses relations of force by distinguishing between the roles played by each participant force. This is to be found in motion as a quality of their concrete becoming. Deleuze writes, in a body, the superior or dominant forces are known as active and the inferior or dominated forces are known as reactive. The difference between active and reactive force concerns the way in which forces function in relation to one another. So it's not as if a force is already identified as active or reactive. It's only in the course of corporeal formation in movement that force might become active or reactive, and that could flip as the body changes and as another kind of iteration emerges. So to say again, the difference between active and reactive force concerns the way in which forces function in relation to one another, in their kind of concrete becoming. Bodies form because forces determine their differences in certain ways, thereby to produce new corporeal formations out of the old. In that sense, the body is a form of movement. Dancing embodies this state of affairs inasmuch as it requires the ongoing and shifting mastery of multiple factors, whether gravity and weight, muscular textures, sensations, perceptions, images, relations with other bodies, or by drawing upon the quasi-givenness of movement material, such as a form or score. Mastery engages circumstance, its field of operation. Circumstance provides the reactive means whereby the activity of force is able to emerge. Mastery masters, but it is also dependent upon this field of exertion, which for its part maintains its own interlocutory character. So I think in thinking this in relation to dance, the question of circumstance is a really big one. The circumstance of this particular body, the circumstance of this field of practice, ecological circumstance, relations between bodies, what's passed before, what's emergent, what's coming up, all elements that kind of constitute a field of circumstance. The activities of force do not eradicate other forces, rather they make use of their characteristic tendencies, drawing upon their very difference. Active and reactive force are both necessary elements in corporeal formation. Movement can be posed in these terms, where one force assumes an active quality in relation to the circumstances of the body, which function as a mode of reaction. So I suppose I should just say here that because of this account, it doesn't only think the body is a kind of well-defined, individuated entity. Because a body forms and it's relational, for example, those of us who did Gary's work yesterday in Alexander technique, and here we are, take ourselves, and then we're starting to kind of open up to the floor. You could say that a body is formed between the floor and the legs, or maybe we can bring it a bit higher, or up here, or out here, or behind there. They're all kind of modes of corporeal formation that will be transitory, mobile, provisional, and emergent. Releasing the breath to soften into the floor, to push away towards length in the body, counterbalancing the pelvis with the skull to articulate the spine, deploying kinesthetic custom to achieve virtuosic expression. To think through each case is to offer an interpretation, identifying that which is active and that which reacts. It may not be clear what is active and what reactive in the given instance. Is it gravity that acts and softening a reaction? Or does the softening deploy gravity to its own ends? Is habit an active or reactive means by which the dance finds expression? In the Nietzschean arena of thought, interpretation is itself an expression of force upon force. Here, the deployment of a certain reading of actions which for their part exert their own characteristic force. The human body is for Deleuze a special corporeal case, a theatre of actions and reactions, modes of organisation, arrangement, play and counterplay. He calls it a multiplicity. Action is the body's signature modality. It constitutes the paradigm of health in the Nietzschean domain. The body belongs to the affirmative domain of the Nietzschean master, finding expression in master activity, according to which active force selects its reactions which for their part respond in action. Consciousness, by contrast, marks a departure from this healthy norm. It belongs to the domain of the slave, who depends upon ressentiment and negation as a way of life. And this just really comes from Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morality. Deleuze offers a particular reading of consciousness as a formation of force at odds with the pragmatic ideal. For Deleuze, when consciousness forms, force becomes reactive, according to which the healthy norm of action is momentarily suspended, its constituent forces reoriented towards the interiority of thought. So I'm not going into this in big detail because it would take a lot of time, but there is, just as much as I've talked much more about the way in which forces combine to create corporeal formation, Deleuze gives a sort of detailed account of to show the way in which forces combine to fold inwards to form experience, the interiority of the self. And it's either one, which is becoming active, or it's another, becoming reactive. So rather than the seat and source of agency and action, conscious thought is that which emerges at the expense of corporeal formation. It is the folding inwards of force through the triumph of reaction. This is the reactive type and its signature affect, ressentiment. So the Nietzschean paradigm replaces the subject as the one who does things with an ontology or ontogenesis of forces. Forces are plural, relational and emergent. Becoming traces the movement from and between one set of forces towards another, between one multiplicity and the next. While this movement is not ascribed to an agent, it nonetheless exhibits a kind of embedded agency or internal dynamic called the will to power. Nietzsche speaks of the will to power as a necessary supplement to the notion of force. Necessary because it speaks to their relationality. So it's part and parcel of corporeal becoming, and just as forces don't exist so kind of on their own, there's a multiplicity which come into relation. The will to power speaks to that relationality. So although force and the will to power are conceptually distinct, the will to power is internal to relations of force. It's embedded within them, an aspect of their plurality and difference. The will to power is plastic, synthetic and genetic. It complements the differential nature of forces, tracing their dynamic reconfiguration and their intensification towards new forms of difference. So I haven't spent a lot of time on will to power, just to say that if you think of forces, a multiplicity of forces, and they're coming together, you need to add just a little bit to think of the way in which they combine to produce modes of becoming. So a key feature of this account is the view that forces are either expressed in corporeal becoming through action, or they fold inwards to create experience. In practice, however, the human multiplicity is likely composed of myriad actions and reactions, some expressed in corporeal form, others in this kind of reactive recalibration. So I'm really saying that, that human being and all the becomings involved in that is likely, if we get down to like an attempt to concretely interpret what's going on, there'll be a bucket load of things going on. So this is a kind of conceptual picture which you then might bring to bear upon concrete modes of practice, experience and becoming. The distinction between active and reactive enables Deleuze to delineate different patterns of becoming, most notably becoming active, found in the movement of forces in corporeal formation, and becoming reactive, the turnaround of force into subjective experience. Consciousness and the body thus represent two types of becoming, different in kind. There are a number of ways in which Deleuze's Nietzsche could be oriented towards dance. Number one, dance is an expression of the active type. The notion of corporeal becoming offers a model of human action pegged to the becomings of force. It sees the movement inherent in dance as an exemplar of what Deleuze calls the active type. The active type is an expression of the Nietzschean master. The master stands for the myriad ways in which relations of force find healthy expression in action. The active type is at work whenever a body is formed and forces coalesce to produce movement. When this happens, active force works its reactions, which for their part are acted, enter into activity. So to be acted means to enter into action as a reaction. To be a reaction in this sense is to play a part, the part of that which responds to something else, another tendency or force. The active type is a model of action, consisting of forces which together become active. This is a sense in which active force has an affinity with the affirmative side of the will to power, seen as a quality of becoming. The active type, or its equivalent, master activity, incorporates all those relations of force that produce the many kinds of corporeal formation to be found within the field of dance. 2. The master's riposte. Dance also avails itself of what Deleuze, following Nietzsche, calls the master's riposte. The master's riposte represents the uptake of experience within action. The master's riposte is important for an account of dancing as it traces the ways in which sensations, perceptions, thoughts and images are formed and subsequently enter into movement. It includes all those activities which take up elements of experience and redeploy them in action. The master's riposte captures the many forms of movement that deploy sensation, thought, affect and imagery. Kinesthetic traditions select the sorts of experiences and attentions belonging to the field, as well as their manner of deployment. Such reactions draw force from culture. They are contextual and contingent. That a particular kinesthetic field selects its domain of preferred reactions is a question of culture, a matter of custom and selection. Culture also speaks to the manner in which the riposte is to occur. So, for example, like release technique might want to draw on sort of sensations of muscularity or holding within the body and deploy them to let go. That's a particular value, a particular kind of kinesthetic desiderata. And there'll be other kinds of techniques or traditions that will have their own modes of somatic attention and sensation that they value that then can be redeployed in action through this notion of the master's riposte. It's a question of kinesthetic values, somatic attention and virtuosic characterization. 3. The work of culture. It's my view that the activity of dancing enunciates its own mode of thought in the body. Such thinking is practice-based, contextual, cultural and kinesthetic. It's heterogeneous, a form of neurospecificity enunciated in action. Deleuze looks to the social production of thought in the body as a question of culture, on the one hand as a mode of subject production, on the other as the acquisition of skill in the body. Thought in terms of relations of force, this conception of cultural practice has two determining moments. One, the formation of what I call movement subjectivity, where the dancer adopts the technologies of thought embedded within a particular field of practice, and 2, the deployment of force in a body able to act according to the kinesthetic values of the field through the inculcation of skill, disposition and facility. Such a view parallels Foucault's analysis of disciplinary practice, which detects the correlative emergence of facility on the one hand and subjection or subjectivation on the other. For Foucault, the body is articulated through the imposition of daily rhythms, regimes and regimens. We would call it practice, which work, quote, slowly through each part of the body, mastering it, making it pliable, ready at all times, turning silently into the automatism of habit, end quote. Their cumulative effect is to engrave memory in the form of habits and habitus, along with a corresponding turning inwards of force. Such a process is temporal and relational, a matter of kinesthetic transmission and corporeal generosity, expressed between teachers, practitioners, students and peers, and comprising the hybrid legacy of practice in the body, which in turn constitutes the dancer's provenance. My last kinesthetic claim is a speculative reading of postmodern dance as a movement between the two key types, subjectivity and the body. It draws on the Nietzschean notion of overcoming to suggest that postmodern practices have a way of decentering the self in action as a way of making movement available. Deleuze has a term for Nietzschean overcoming. He calls it active destruction. Active destruction is a movement on the part of the self towards its own overcoming, an expression of the will to be overcome. Consider, for example, Yvonne Rayner's Trio A, which emerged in New York at a time when its dance scene rejected certain kinds of performative expressivity in favour of a more work-like absorption in task-based activity. To what extent might we suggest that Trio A requires a shift away from authorial notions of subjective agency? Do you think we've got time to do the vid? Thank you. Sarah Rudner speaks of dancing Trio A. When it came right down to it and you were there to do the dance, the best thing that happened was the body took over and the dance happened. What does it mean to say the body took over? While Rudner highlights the domain of the corporeal, many years later, Rayner comes at it from another point of view, through describing the performative subjectivity of Trio A as a mode of subjectivity which is, quote, at once produced, erased and confounded. For Rayner, the dancing self recuses herself in action. That's what judges do when they admit or perceive a conflict of interest. They recuse themselves. So for Rayner, the dancing self recuses herself in action. Others speak of a certain need to get out of the way. I turn now, John Dee turns now to another iconic dance, Trisha Brown's accumulation with talking with water motor. Brown's virtuosity is an instance of what choreographer Russell Dumas calls smart dancing. Dancing that calls for more than conscious sovereignty can manage. Some years ago, Dumas asked his dancers to perform the children's rhyme Tony Chestnut in canon between the left and right side. So Tony, I didn't know Tony Chestnut, but it goes Tony Chestnut, Tony Chestnut knows I love you, knows I love you, blah, 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 blah. That's what Tony knows. But doing it the left side, one moment behind the right side. Although one could learn each moment of the canon and repeat its solution, so go, yeah, when this happens, that happens, this happens, that happens. The choreographic point was to find a way of enacting a simultaneous plurality of actions without directing traffic. For me, this meant letting go of any conscious attempt to keep track, requiring instead an active decentering of a certain kind of self which experiences itself as author and agent. Postmodern choreographic processes of deconstructive variation also function beyond the knowing subjectivity of the mover. In practice, this means working with strategies that aim to decenter and displace the familiar kinesthetic territory embodied by the choreographer or dancer. There are many ways in which this might occur, for example through techniques of cut and paste, the production of retrograde variations, pleating, folding and suturing movement, so as to create new flows and demands on the body of the dancer. While movement material may have become with a set of movements that feel familiar and recognisable, a completely new corporeal logic arises through inserting arbitrary breaks and shifting the order and flow of movement. The task of the dancer is to perform these uncanny movements, to enable a body to adapt to an entirely different corporeal logic formed outside that which the dancer already knows, requiring the formation of novel corporeal capacities on the part of the body to traverse, connect, and make possible new kinesthetic assemblages. I've got about 2 minutes to go. I think that, okay, so my last example is in the work of Deborah Hay. In a workshop held in January this year, Deborah Hay asked practitioners to engage in an ongoing practice of desubjectification, imagining the dance being served by how we see its environment as the unfolding multiplicity of perceptual moments, without following through on perceptual experience by trying to think about it or even trying to remember it. So for Hay, we try to open up the body to movement and then worked with these like particular perceptions from one to the next to the next, trying not to go, oh, I see the chair and I'm going to start thinking about that, or this happened and I'm going to sort of drift off thinking about that. Hay speaks of disattaching from experience, of noticing its tendency towards further thought or perceptual editing and letting that go. She offers the formulation here and gone, to encourage momentary engagement without giving in to its inevitable cognitive encroachment. Although clearly experiential, there is at the same time an ongoing effort to deconstruct the memorial coherence of felt subjectivity, the aim of which is to foster the serial production of movement. Dancers work hard, taking in and letting go, disattaching at the same time as allowing movement to emerge in the body. Like Trisha Brown's dancing and talking, there's a double activity here between the body's dance and subjective awareness. Hay curls her fist above her head to signal that part of the self that watches the work unfold over time. Quote, I am here overseeing the experiment. The body is the field of experimentation. The work is overseeing how the experiment unfolds. You are not the experiment. End quote. Hay's workshop can be interpreted along 3 intersecting axes. 1, subject-centred, the 2nd, body-centred, the 3rd, a form of movement between the 2. The subject-centred perspective, on the practice. So the subject-centred perspective on the practice moves towards a bodily form of overcoming through staging its own undoing. The practice of what Hay calls cellular reconfiguration invokes a kind of desubjectification exerted through disattachment to the flow of perceptual experience and strategies such as here and gone, which resist the construction of the memorial self. And yet, The work is a form of work on the part of the subject, the work of opening the self to a non-linear flow of experiences, machinic seriality, so as to overcome, to actively deconstruct the person as dancer in favour of a greater sense of corporeal possibility. While there is inevitably and importantly a role for the subject in these practices, they also embody an image of thought Deleuze attributes to Nietzsche, in which thought is an arrow shot into the air and picked up by another thinker. The body is that thinker, a figure of embodied cognition, affiliated with but not reducible to the dancing self.